Welcome, dear friends of mystery, to a quiet evening where snow drifts gently across the rooftops and lamplight flickers warmly on frosted windows. Tonight, we share a tale titled The Stolen Letter at Christmas, a Miss Marple Mystery. Picture the village of St. Everwood, each cottage trimmed with holly and twinkling candles, the air alive with the scent of pine and simmering spices. Behind lace curtains, secrets stir quietly, waiting for keen eyes to notice. Pour yourself a steaming cup of tea or cocoa, sink into your favorite armchair, and let us embark on this festive yet curious adventure. And tell me, what Christmas tradition fills your heart with magic? The village of St. Everwood lay wrapped in a soft white blanket, the snow muffling footsteps and carrying a serene hush through the narrow cobbled streets. Inside the warm glow of their homes, families gathered around fireplaces, voices blending with the distant ringing of church bells and the soft strains of carols drifting through frosted windows. Yet, even in this season of cheer, a subtle tension lingered. Mrs. Pembroke, the postmistress, moved carefully along the quiet street toward the small wooden posting box at the corner, her breath curling in the crisp air. She opened the box to find it curiously lighter than usual. One envelope, plain and unmarked except for its seal, was missing. Its intended recipient was unknown to her, yet the urgency it carried felt palpable, as though the letter itself trembled with a secret too perilous to speak aloud. Snowflakes settled gently on the lamplight, casting fleeting shadows that danced across the cobblestones. A shiver ran through Mrs. Pembroke, not from the cold, but from the uneasy sense that this was no ordinary correspondence. Somewhere in the quiet village, a secret waited, poised to disrupt the peaceful holiday night. And as the clock in the square creaked toward midnight, the whisper of that unseen danger seemed to echo through every silent street. Chapter 1. A Village Dressed in Snow. The morning light of St. Everwood glinted softly on rooftops dusted with snow, and the village seemed to awaken as though from a gentle, festive dream. Every cottage bore the marks of holiday cheer. Wreaths of holly hung on doors, sprigs of mistletoe peeked from window ledges, and ribbons fluttered in the crisp winter breeze. The cobblestone streets, slick and sparkling from frost, echoed with the rhythmic clatter of wooden boots and the occasional cheerful bark of a dog racing along the lane. At the heart of the village, the small post office bustled with a quiet energy. Letters stamped and parcels tied with red twine stacked in neat piles, while the postmistress, Mrs. Pembroke, moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had delivered both messages and village secrets for decades. Villagers trickled in, some eager to post their Christmas greetings, others stopping to exchange the latest news, always with a sharp eye and a soft smile. Old Mr. Thompson, leaning on his cane, lingered by the counter, nodding to everyone he passed, though his eyes twinkled with curiosity at every whispered conversation. Young Alice Harper, cheeks flushed with the cold, chattered endlessly about the decorations she had strung in the town square, while her mother fussed discreetly at her unruly scarf. Even the quiet vicar, Reverend Smythe, dropped in for a parcel, exchanging polite greetings with nods that carried a weight of concern for the parish he tended. Through it all, the air carried a mixture of scents: burning pine from nearby hearths, warm bread from Mrs. Whittaker's bakery, and the faint tang of snow from the lanes outside. Church bells began rehearsing the melodies for the evening carols, their clear, sonorous tones rippling across the village, mingling with the low murmur of gossip and laughter. Each face and each small interaction wove together a tapestry of village life, ordinary, familiar, yet brimming with the tiny tensions and hidden curiosities that often foreshadowed the unexpected. Beneath the cheerful bustle, the stage was quietly being set for events that might disturb even this picturesque piece, though none yet suspected what a single missing letter could ignite. Mrs. Pembroke had just returned from arranging the last of the parcels on the post-office shelves when a peculiar thought struck her. One envelope, the one she had carefully noted the day before, was nowhere to be found. It was small, unassuming, sealed with a deep crimson wax stamp, and addressed to someone whose name she did not recognize. Yet the absence of that letter gnawed at her, a strange unease she could not quite explain. Her fingers hovered over the empty spot where it should have rested. How could it have vanished from the locked box? Mrs. Pembroke retraced her steps mentally, recalling that she had personally collected every posted item from the drop that very morning. No one else had the keys. The thought that someone might have deliberately taken it sent a shiver down her spine. By mid-morning, word of the missing letter began to slip out in fragments, carried along like snowflakes by the villagers themselves. At the bakery, Mrs. Whittaker lowered her voice as she told a customer, "It seems Mrs. Pembroke has mislaid something, or perhaps it's been taken." In the churchyard, two elderly ladies whispered over their knitted scarves, speculating in tones hushed enough to suggest they feared eavesdroppers. Among the post-office regulars, curiosity sparked instantly. Mr. Thompson, leaning heavily on his cane, peered over his spectacles, muttering to anyone who would listen, "Now, who in their right mind would want to take a letter without a word?" The young Alice Harper, forever inquisitive, pressed her nose against the counter, listening intently to the snippets of conversation that fluttered around her like restless birds. Even Mrs. Pembroke herself could not help but feel the rising tension. The thought that an ordinary envelope could stir such a ripple of attention unsettled her, though she tried to maintain her usual calm demeanor. The villagers' reactions were telling, the way they glanced at one another, the sudden stillness when certain names were mentioned, the barely suppressed smirks or furrowed brows. Speculation began to branch in countless directions. Was it a personal confession? A secret of wealth or inheritance? Something scandalous that someone was desperate to hide? No one could say, and yet everyone seemed to have an opinion. Each whisper, each exchange of curious glances, deepened the sense that this was no ordinary day in St. Everwood. Beneath the cheerful Christmas bustle, a thread of unease was weaving itself quietly into the fabric of the village, ready to tangle lives in ways no one could yet imagine. By noon, the post office had become a hub of nervous energy, the missing letter an unspoken mystery hanging in the air, waiting for keen eyes to notice the subtle clues that others overlooked. Mrs. Pembroke, though anxious, felt the thrill of anticipation mingling with her worry, as if the village itself had collectively held its breath, poised for a story that was just beginning. Miss Marple arrived in St. Everwood that afternoon, her small handbag clasped neatly in one hand and a woolen muff snug around the other. The crisp air nipped at her cheeks, but she welcomed it. There was nothing quite like a winter's walk through a village dusted in snow to sharpen the senses. She had come to visit her goddaughter, Lucy, who lived in a charming cottage near the village square, but already the familiar rhythm of village life hinted that today would be unlike any ordinary holiday gathering. Stepping into the warmth of Lucy's kitchen, Miss Marple was greeted by the scent of simmering stew and freshly baked bread. Villagers who had wandered in to exchange a word or leave a package lingered, their voices hushed but edged with excitement, or perhaps unease. She noticed, as she often did, the subtle tension in their gestures, a twitch of the hand, a quick glance exchanged, the way eyebrows rose at certain names. It did not take long for the story of the missing letter to reach her ears. Whispers fluttered from one visitor to another, punctuated by small gasps and murmurs. "It's gone," someone said, glancing toward the post-office counter. "No one knows where it could be," another voice added. "I heard it might contain something delicate." Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile, not of amusement, but of recognition, the beginnings of a puzzle forming, pieces scattered across the village like snowflakes. While others fretted and speculated, Miss Marple's eyes quietly absorbed every detail. The crooked sign above the post office, the footprints leading away from the square, the subtle gestures of nervous villagers, all whispered stories to those who knew how to listen. She noted the anxious twitch of Mrs. Pembroke's fingers, the way Mr. Thompson lingered just long enough near the counter to overhear, but never speak, and the glimmer of curiosity lighting Alice Harper's wide eyes. To the casual observer, the missing letter might have seemed a simple misplacement, a minor holiday inconvenience. Yet Miss Marple, with her calm and patient scrutiny, sensed a deeper significance, an invisible thread tying together the village's gossip, its secrets, and perhaps even a motive waiting quietly in plain sight. As the afternoon waned and the shadows lengthened across the frosted cobbles outside, she settled into her chair, ready to unravel the mysteries that were already beginning to stir within St. Everwood. The sun dipped lower behind the distant hills, casting long, pale shadows across the cobblestone streets of St. Everwood. Snow crunched softly under Miss Marple's boots as she strolled toward the village square, her eyes quietly observing the familiar sights with a sharper awareness than usual. The cheerful bustle of Christmas preparations continued around her, yet beneath the twinkling lights and fragrant wreaths, something felt unsettled. Near the post office, a figure lingered just beyond the doorway, half hidden by the shadow of a lamp-post. The person shifted restlessly, glancing toward the box with an anxious energy that contrasted sharply with the calm decorum of the morning's visitors. Miss Marple paused, her keen eyes noting the careful glances, the hesitation in each step. It was not overtly suspicious, at least not to the casual passer-by, but to her experienced mind, every nuance spoke volumes. A faint whisper reached her ears, two villagers speaking in hurried tones behind a stack of firewood. Their heads were close together, their words muffled, yet the urgency in their voices carried across the crisp evening air. "Did you see?" one murmured. "It simply vanished." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, listening for more, storing every fragment of conversation. Every secret shared in hushed tones, every glance darted furtively, was a piece of the puzzle. As she turned a corner, a shadow moved along the edge of the snow-laden lane, disappearing almost as suddenly as it appeared. The fleeting figure melted into the night, leaving only an imprint of footprints that trailed toward the outskirts of the village. Miss Marple bent slightly to study them, noting their size, their direction, the cautious pacing. Nothing about this village walk was ordinary tonight. The air, crisp and scented with pine, seemed to carry a subtle tension, as if the village itself held its breath. Even the familiar chiming of the church bells sounded slightly hollow, echoing off the rooftops in a way that made the silence between strokes feel deeper, heavier. Miss Marple straightened and continued toward Lucy's cottage, her mind quietly assembling the threads she had observed, the lingering figure, the hushed whispers, the disappearing shadow. Beneath the warmth and merriment of St. Everwood's Christmas preparations, a quiet unease had settled, one that promised the night would bring more than carols and cocoa. Somewhere, hidden in plain sight, the first hints of a mystery were beginning to take shape, and the village's peaceful facade was already trembling. Chapter 2. Murmurs by the Hearth. Evening settled over St. Everwood with a velvet hush, broken only by the occasional tinkle of sleigh bells or the low murmur of villagers gathering in warm kitchens and snug parlors. Fires crackled in hearths, sending flickering shadows across walls adorned with holly and candles. Inside one such home, the subtle hum of conversation carried secrets and curiosity in equal measure, and tonight the missing letter was the favorite topic of every tongue. Miss Marple, seated quietly near Lucy's window, observed the lively room with her accustomed calm. At the hearth, Mrs. Whittaker, the baker's wife, leaned forward, whispering to her neighbor, "I heard from young Alice that the postmistress herself is quite flustered. Such a thing has never happened before." The neighbor nodded solemnly, fanning herself with a handkerchief, as if the very news might make her faint. Across the room, Mr. Thompson, his cane tapping the floor in irregular rhythm, offered his own theories, voice low but insistent. "It could be a matter of inheritance," he murmured, leaning toward anyone within earshot. "Or perhaps a secret meant to stay buried. These letters sometimes carry more than words, you know." His gaze swept the room, noting who responded with curiosity, who with disdain, and who with outright amusement. Even the younger villagers could not resist the current of speculation. Alice Harper, her cheeks pink from the fire's warmth, pressed closer to Miss Marple, whispering eagerly, "Do you think someone might have taken it to hide something bad?" Her wide eyes shone with both excitement and apprehension. Miss Marple offered only a slight nod, letting the child's energy mingle with the adult's anxious murmurs, all while her mind quietly catalogued every detail. The conversations twisted and turned, branching into romantic intrigues, possible blackmail, imagined inheritances, and fanciful tales of mischief. Every snippet of gossip, every raised eyebrow, every pause in speech seemed insignificant to the untrained eye, yet Miss Marple noted them all with careful precision. She understood, as always, that even the smallest hint might illuminate a much larger truth. As the evening deepened, the murmurs of the village swirled around the flickering firelight, wrapping the room in a cozy yet tense cocoon. The ordinary cheer of a winter's night mingled uneasily with the thrill of mystery, and every whispered theory, every sideways glance, hinted that the missing letter was already beginning to weave its invisible thread through the lives of St. Everwood's residents. The next morning, a pale winter sun filtered through frost-laced windows, painting the village square in a soft, silvery light. Miss Marple, sipping her morning tea, listened as the hum of St. Everwood's daily routines stirred once more, yet the undercurrent of curiosity about the missing letter persisted like a quiet, persistent wind. The village, though dressed in holiday cheer, carried a subtle tension, as if each chimney's smoke whispered questions that no one dared to answer aloud. Among the villagers who passed through the square, Mrs. Pembroke's anxious demeanor did not go unnoticed. Whispers suggested the letter might be connected to a wealthy benefactor, one whose generosity had quietly shaped many lives in St. Everwood. Some speculated it could concern an unexpected inheritance, a declaration of gratitude, or perhaps a confidential confession. The possibilities seemed endless, and each imagined scenario carried the promise of both scandal and intrigue. Miss Marple, ever patient and quietly attentive, observed each villager's reaction to these rumors. Mr. Thompson's eyes flickered with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity, while young Alice Harper clutched her mother's coat, wide-eyed and eager to hear more. Even the vicar, Reverend Smythe, paused in his morning rounds, adjusting his spectacles as if to better see what everyone was whispering about, though he carefully restrained his own comments. As Miss Marple strolled past the post-office, she noted the delicate way Mrs. Pembroke fussed with the remaining letters, her hands trembling slightly. The postmistress's unease only deepened the sense that the missing envelope was no ordinary correspondence. Even from a distance, the subtle signals, the way villagers shifted uneasily, the hushed tones of conversations halting when certain names were mentioned, spoke volumes to those with eyes to see. By mid-morning, the village square had transformed into a tapestry of speculation. Every glance, every hushed comment, seemed to hint at a story just out of reach, a secret poised to surface. Miss Marple, with her calm demeanor and sharp observation, understood that the key to this puzzle was hidden not in the obvious, but in the quiet, overlooked details of human behavior, the small gestures, the fleeting expressions, the almost imperceptible signs that revealed far more than words ever could. And so, as the bells of St. Everwood's church chimed gently in the distance, Miss Marple sensed that the missing letter's true significance lay not merely in its contents, but in the invisible threads it was beginning to weave through the lives of everyone in the village. By mid-afternoon, the warmth of Lucy's cottage had become a sanctuary against the chill of St. Everwood's snow-laden streets. Miss Marple settled into her favorite armchair, a steaming cup of tea in hand, while the afternoon sun filtered through frost-framed windows, casting soft patterns across the hearth. The room, cozy and fragrant with pine and baking spices, filled steadily with familiar villagers who had come under the guise of holiday cheer, though most could not resist the subtle pull of curiosity about the missing letter. Mrs. Pembroke arrived first, her hands fluttering as she clutched a folded handkerchief, her voice a blend of anxiety and relief. "I thought I might find you here, Miss Marple," she murmured, lowering herself into a chair. "It's simply the letter. I cannot imagine who would," she faltered, and Miss Marple gave a gentle nod, encouraging her to continue in her own time. The other visitors trickled in, Mr. Thompson leaning on his cane, his eyes sharp beneath bushy brows, Alice Harper peering around the doorway with uncontainable curiosity, and even Reverend Smythe, nodding politely but carrying the weight of a man aware of the village's every nuance. As tea was poured and scones passed, conversation began cautiously, voices dipping to conspiratorial tones whenever the missing letter was mentioned. Miss Marple listened more than she spoke, allowing the villagers to reveal themselves in the subtlest ways. The anxious tug of Mrs. Pembroke's sleeve, the sideways glances Mr. Thompson exchanged with other guests, the quiet fidgeting of Alice Harper as she leaned closer to catch every word, all of these details were recorded silently by Miss Marple's keen eye. Each motion, each hesitation, each flicker of expression was a clue in itself, an insight into motives, fears, and the secrets that thrived in the shadows of St. Everwood. When a lull fell over the group, Miss Marple spoke softly, her words chosen with care, drawing out information without forcing it. "Sometimes," she said, "the smallest things reveal the greatest truths. A glance, a pause, the way a hand trembles, these often tell more than the words we say aloud." Her voice carried the calm authority of one who had solved countless puzzles before, and the villagers could not help but respond. They spoke cautiously, revealing glimpses of who had been near the post office, who had lingered suspiciously, who had seemed particularly eager to know the letter's contents. By the time the tea had cooled and the last crumb of scone vanished, Miss Marple had quietly assembled the beginnings of a map, a mental sketch of relationships, opportunities, and small inconsistencies that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. The villagers, still unaware of the precision with which she had taken note, left with a mixture of relief and lingering tension, each carrying their own suspicions and conjectures. Alone for a brief moment, Miss Marple set down her cup, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. The missing letter, she realized, was not merely a matter of post or accident. It was a thread, subtle yet unbreakable, weaving through the village's very fabric. And she, as ever, intended to follow it wherever it led. The late afternoon shadows had begun to stretch long across the village streets, and the first hints of evening settled over St. Everwood, softening the sharp outlines of snow-laden rooftops. Inside Lucy's cozy cottage, the fire burned steadily, filling the room with warmth and the faint scent of burning pine. Miss Marple sat quietly in her armchair, her keen eyes observing the subtle shifts of her visitors as they discussed the day's events in hushed tones. The mystery of the missing letter lingered in the air, almost tangible, as though it had taken on a life of its own. A sudden, brisk knock at the door made everyone start slightly, the sound sharp against the gentle crackle of the fire. Miss Marple rose gracefully, smoothing her woolen skirt as she moved to answer it. On the doorstep stood a villager, breath visible in the cold evening air, their eyes wide and nervous. They held a small, folded note, delivered under the guise of secrecy. The envelope was unmarked, yet its urgency was unmistakable. It trembled slightly in the villager's gloved hands. Inside, as the door closed behind them, whispers erupted among those gathered. The visitor's words were careful, measured, almost rehearsed, yet the implication was clear. Someone had observed a crucial detail regarding the missing letter, a fragment of truth previously unknown. Miss Marple, however, listened quietly, her expression serene, betraying none of the subtle excitement stirring in her mind. Every gesture, every inflection of voice, was a piece of the puzzle, and she catalogued them meticulously. The firelight flickered across the faces in the room, highlighting the tension that mingled with the usual holiday cheer. Even the young Alice Harper sensed the gravity of the moment, her bright eyes reflecting both curiosity and apprehension. Outside, the snow continued to fall, muffling sounds and heightening the sense of isolation, as if the village itself had paused to listen. By the time the visitor departed, the atmosphere in the cottage had shifted subtly. Hushed conversations gave way to thoughtful silence, punctuated only by the occasional crackle of the fire. Miss Marple sank back into her chair, fingertips resting lightly over her steaming cup of tea. The letter, she realized, was more than a missing piece of correspondence. It was a catalyst, stirring the undercurrents of secrecy, fear, and curiosity that ran beneath the surface of St. Everwood. And somewhere beyond the snow-covered streets, the threads of this quiet mystery were beginning to tighten, drawing the village ever closer to revelations that would change its Christmas forever. Chapter 3. The Festival of Carols. The evening air was crisp and sparkling as the villagers of St. Everwood made their way toward the old parish church, its stone walls aglow with lanterns and the flicker of candles through frost-kissed windows. The scent of pine and roasting chestnuts drifted from nearby cottages, mingling with the soft crunch of snow under boots. Though the season called for cheer, there was an undercurrent of anticipation threading through the crowd, a subtle tension that whispered of the missing letter and the secrets it concealed. Inside the church, the warm glow of candlelight illuminated pews polished from decades of worship, and the flickering flames danced across faces eager to join in song. Choir boys adjusted their collars, while parents straightened coats and mufflers, the air filled with a gentle rustle of program sheets. Miss Marple, seated quietly near the rear, observed everything with calm attention, the careful positioning of certain villagers, the nervous fidgeting of others, and the glances exchanged that seemed to carry unspoken questions. As the first notes of the carol rose, the choir's voices melded into a harmonious swell, filling the church with resonant warmth. The congregation sang along, some more confidently than others, their voices blending into a single tapestry of festive joy. Yet even amid the music, subtle movements and fleeting expressions did not escape Miss Marple's notice. She saw Mr. Thompson's hand brushing slightly against a neighboring coat as if to gauge a reaction, and Alice Harper's wide eyes darting to a corner where a shadow seemed unusually still. The gentle rhythm of the hymn did little to quiet the whispers circulating in the pews. Speculations about the letter, its contents, its disappearance, and its potential consequences, passed from person to person like a secret current beneath the surface of holiday cheer. Every word, every glance, carried a weight that the casual listener might miss, but Miss Marple catalogued each carefully, her mind weaving them into a pattern that hinted at hidden truths. By the time the final verse drew to a close and the organ's last notes lingered, a sense of unease had subtly permeated the room. The villagers, though outwardly merry, carried a flicker of apprehension in their eyes, and Miss Marple, her senses keen and her mind already connecting invisible threads, realized that even amidst carols and candlelight, the shadows of secrets were never far from view in St. Everwood. As the congregation rose from the final hymn, the warm glow of the church seemed to highlight subtle interactions that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Miss Marple's sharp eyes, ever observant, caught a fleeting exchange between two villagers near the rear pew. Their conversation was quiet, a whisper barely audible over the shuffle of boots and rustle of coats, yet the tension in their posture spoke volumes. One hand brushed against the other's coat, a gesture casual to the untrained eye, but charged with significance to anyone accustomed to reading human behavior. The taller of the two, a man who often kept to himself during village gatherings, leaned slightly closer, his eyes darting briefly toward the choir before meeting his companion's gaze. The other, a woman known for her impeccable manners, seemed momentarily startled, then quickly masked any sign of unease with a polite smile. Miss Marple noted the quick, almost imperceptible tightening of her fingers around her muff and the subtle shift in her stance as they moved toward the exit. Outside, the snow crunched beneath the villagers' boots as they filed down the path, lanterns casting a golden glow across the pristine white drifts. Yet even amid the cheerful chatter and laughter, Miss Marple's mind remained attuned to the small, peculiar signals, a glance that lingered too long, a gesture that seemed out of place, the nervous straightening of a coat. Every minor detail became a clue, each one threading into the larger tapestry of the missing letter and the undercurrents it had stirred in St. Everwood. Alice Harper, skipping ahead of her mother, whispered to Miss Marple, "Did you see that?" They were whispering, and then he touched her coat. Miss Marple smiled faintly, nodding, though her eyes remained focused on the two figures now disappearing down a snowy lane. She understood the importance of what had just passed. Small gestures often carried the weight of intention, and intentions were the seeds from which mysteries grew. As the villagers dispersed toward their homes, their voices fading into the evening hush, Miss Marple lingered a moment, letting the scene settle into her mind. Even in the heart of Christmas cheer, the ordinary could conceal the extraordinary, and the smallest exchanges often revealed what others were desperate to hide. Beneath the warmth of lantern light and laughter, St. Everwood's secrets were beginning to stir, and Miss Marple, with her patient and discerning eye, was ready to trace each subtle clue to its source. As the villagers settled back into their pews for the evening service, a low murmur of conversation rippled quietly beneath the choir's postlude. Miss Marple, seated near the rear, observed the subtle movements of those around her, the way a hand nervously tapped against a hymn-book, the quick exchange of glances between neighbors, and the almost imperceptible leaning in to catch snippets of whispered words. It was here, in these small, seemingly inconsequential interactions, that the true texture of the village's unease revealed itself. Whispers began to spread, tentative, careful, yet impossible to suppress entirely. One woman, her lips pressed into a thin line of concern, murmured about the letter's possible contents. "They say it might reveal a secret long hidden," she whispered to the man beside her, who nodded, eyes darting toward the front of the church as though someone might overhear. Another villager, leaning closer to his companion, speculated about scandal, quietly imagining clandestine affairs or undisclosed debts. Every whisper carried its own flavor of fear or intrigue, blending with the crisp scent of pine and the faint warmth of candlelight to form a tapestry of speculation. Miss Marple's gaze shifted from group to group, noting the nuances that most would overlook. The nervous scratching of Mr. Thompson's chin, the excited whispering of Alice Harper to anyone who would listen, the polite yet cautious nods of Reverend Smythe, all these signals, she realized, were pieces of a larger puzzle. Each fragment, when examined carefully, hinted at relationships and secrets that might otherwise remain invisible. The tension was not overt, but threaded subtly through the congregation, like a shadow passing over the glow of a winter morning. Even as carols continued softly in the background, every hushed exchange felt as though it might carry a truth the village had long been too polite to acknowledge openly. Miss Marple noted which whispers were repeated, which were eagerly passed on, and which seemed designed to mislead, an intricate dance of gossip, half-truths, and speculation. By the time the service concluded, the air in the church seemed charged with expectation. Conversations swirled and dispersed, leaving traces of unease in their wake. Miss Marple remained seated for a moment longer, her keen mind weaving together the threads she had observed. Beneath the familiar veneer of Christmas cheer, she recognized the careful structure of a mystery beginning to take shape. Secrets whispered in pews, glances exchanged with silent intent, and the invisible pull of a letter whose absence had stirred the very heart of St. Everwood. Even in a place as quaint and picturesque as this, she thought, human curiosity and hidden truths were never far behind. And somewhere in the village, the missing letter waited, its significance quietly growing, ready to unravel lives in ways no one yet anticipated. As twilight deepened, the church's candles flickered gently, casting dancing shadows across the ancient wooden pews. The villagers of St. Everwood had begun to disperse, their voices hushed as they whispered goodbyes and promised to meet again for festive gatherings. Yet the lingering warmth of the service contrasted sharply with a subtle tension that had begun to settle over the parish. Something in the air felt fragile, like the thin candle flames themselves, easily disturbed, yet vital to the ambience of the evening. Miss Marple remained seated near the back, her keen eyes scanning the retreating figures, noting every slight gesture and nuance. Her attention was drawn to a sudden small flicker of movement near the far aisle. One candle, precariously perched in its holder, guttered and went out with a soft sigh, leaving a shadow that stretched across the polished floorboards. Most villagers paid it no mind, absorbed as they were in farewells and polite chatter. But to Miss Marple, the extinguished flame seemed almost symbolic, a subtle reminder that even in moments of cheer, darkness could intrude. Outside, the snow continued to fall in gentle waves, muffling sounds and creating a sense of isolation. Miss Marple noticed how villagers paused, adjusting their coats, clutching scarves, and checking for companions before stepping into the cold. Their behavior, so ordinary on the surface, revealed to her a shared unease, the awareness that something unseen had shifted the usual harmony of St. Everwood. A small group lingered near the door, speaking in hushed tones about the missing letter. Their words floated faintly toward Miss Marple, speculation, concern, and subtle hints of accusation. "It's troubling," one whispered. "Who could have taken it, and why?" Each syllable carried weight, their meaning magnified by the surrounding silence. Miss Marple listened, storing the details carefully, aware that the most revealing truths often hid in the quietest moments. As the last of the villagers departed, the church fell into a profound stillness, broken only by the occasional creak of wood and the soft sigh of wind through the stained-glass windows. Miss Marple rose, her thoughts already weaving together the threads of observation from the day, the whispered rumors, the fleeting gestures, the candle that had burned out at precisely the right moment. Each detail suggested that the missing letter was more than a simple curiosity. It was a catalyst, stirring unseen currents that had begun to ripple through the village, promising a mystery that would unfold in ways both surprising and inevitable. Chapter 4. Secrets at the Inn. The carriage rolled smoothly along the snow-dusted lanes of St. Everwood, its horses' hooves tapping a measured rhythm on the frozen cobbles. Miss Marple peered through the frosted window, noting the familiar charm of the village blurred beneath a soft white haze. Tonight, she was bound for Lady Elspeth's manor, a grand house perched on the hill just beyond the village, where wealth and tradition intertwined like the gilded ribbons draped across its windows. The manor's exterior glimmered in the late afternoon light, each window framed with holly garlands and twinkling lanterns, promising warmth and festivity within. Yet Miss Marple, ever perceptive, sensed that beneath the glittering surface lay layers of intrigue waiting to be uncovered. Lady Elspeth, known for her elegance and exacting manners, had a reputation for hosting gatherings that were as enchanting as they were complex, weaving together family, friends, and acquaintances in a delicate social dance. Upon arrival, Miss Marple was greeted at the door by a butler whose polished demeanor suggested both efficiency and discretion. Inside, the manor sparkled with festive decorations. Crystal chandeliers reflected the glow of countless candles, wreaths of evergreen and holly adorned every doorway, and the scent of roasting meats mingled with the rich aroma of spiced wine. Servants moved gracefully through the halls, attending to last-minute arrangements and ensuring that each guest felt both welcomed and observed. As she entered the grand drawing-room, Miss Marple took in the scene with quiet appreciation. Guests mingled, exchanging pleasantries and polite laughter, their fine attire contrasting sharply with the cozy simplicity of the village she had left behind. Yet in every measured smile, every carefully modulated tone of voice, she detected subtle currents, tensions hidden beneath civility, secrets tucked beneath velvet and lace. Conversations paused just a moment too long when certain names were mentioned, eyes flicked briefly toward corners where no one lingered, and delicate gestures carried a weight beyond mere politeness. Miss Marple allowed herself a small, knowing smile. In a house so richly adorned, so meticulously prepared for holiday cheer, it was all too easy for the extraordinary to hide behind the ordinary. And tonight, as carols drifted faintly from the organ in the hall and glasses of wine sparkled in the candlelight, she felt the unmistakable thrill of anticipation. Somewhere amid the laughter, the glittering decorations, and the carefully curated perfection of Lady Elspeth's manor, a mystery awaited discovery. The grand drawing-room of Lady Elspeth's manor hummed with polite conversation, punctuated by the occasional clink of crystal glasses and the soft strains of a harpist tuning in the corner. Guests smiled and exchanged greetings, their laughter carefully measured, their voices modulated to convey warmth and charm. Yet Miss Marple, seated quietly near the fireplace with her teacup in hand, observed the subtle fractures beneath the surface, a tension that no ornament, no candlelight, could entirely conceal. She noticed the furtive glances cast between certain couples, the brief tightening of jaws as names were mentioned in passing, and the delicate arching of eyebrows when topics of family or inheritance arose. Even the servants, who moved with practiced discretion, carried the faintest trace of unease in their swift, precise steps. Every gesture, every pause, whispered of histories and rivalries known only to those within the manor's walls. The missing letter, though unspoken, seemed to hover in the air like a ghost. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the flicker of curiosity and anxiety in the eyes of several guests, moments when polite conversation faltered, replaced by an unguarded question that was quickly masked by a smile. She observed how some guests lingered near the hearth a little longer than necessary, while others drifted toward corners where whispered discussions could be carried on in privacy. The social choreography was flawless on the surface, but the undercurrent of unease was palpable to anyone willing to notice. Alice Harper, sitting close to Miss Marple, whispered in her ear, "Do you think they're all thinking about the letter?" Miss Marple only smiled faintly, her mind quietly connecting these subtle observations. She had long learned that silence often spoke louder than words, and that the weight of concealed resentment could be measured in a single glance, a carefully placed pause, or the stiff curve of a polite smile. Lady Elspeth herself, poised and elegant as ever, moved among her guests with a practised grace, yet even she could not entirely mask the tension in the room. Miss Marple noted the tiny signs, a hand brushing an ornament too carefully, a slight hesitation before responding to a question, the brief, anxious survey of faces before laughter resumed. Each moment was a clue, a subtle signal that the missing letter's influence had already begun to ripple through the manor, shaping thoughts, stirring doubts, and quietly igniting a web of curiosity that would not soon be forgotten. The grand drawing-room hummed with the quiet elegance of holiday cheer, yet beneath the polished laughter and the soft clinking of glasses, Miss Marple sensed the currents of unease deepening. She had noticed, throughout the evening, the furtive glances and nervous gestures of several guests, but one in particular caught her attention, a young man, Mr. Henry Calder, who lingered near the fireplace, shifting his weight from foot to foot and avoiding the polite chatter around him. There was something in the set of his shoulders, the way his hands twisted together, that suggested he carried a burden too heavy for casual conversation. Miss Marple, observing discreetly, waited. She had long learned that people rarely confess outright unless the moment was coaxed gently, the listener patient and non-judgmental. As she sipped her tea, she caught Calder's eyes briefly, and he gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, as though he had decided she was someone who might understand. Moving closer with careful, unobtrusive steps, Miss Marple leaned slightly toward him, speaking softly. "It seems you have something on your mind, Mr. Calder. Perhaps it would ease you to share it." The young man swallowed hard, his lips parting as if to speak, and then he paused, glancing toward the doorway as though the very walls might have ears. I thought I should tell someone, but His words trailed off, the confession dangling tantalizingly in the air. Miss Marple's sharp eyes noted the tension in his hands, the flicker of guilt, or perhaps fear, that passed across his face. It was not a full revelation, yet it carried enough weight to suggest he knew more than he should, or had played a part, however minor, in the mystery that had gripped St. Everwood. Before he could continue, a sudden disturbance near the dining area drew attention. Lady Elspeth's voice rang out, calling a guest to view a decorative display of candles and holly. Calder straightened immediately, the moment of confession lost as he melted back into the polite bustle of the manor. Miss Marple allowed the interruption to pass without comment, her mind cataloguing every fragment she had gleaned. A confession half-made often revealed far more than a complete one. Hesitation, avoidance, and the choice of words spoke volumes about the inner workings of conscience and fear. As the evening pressed on, Miss Marple remained quietly observant, noting Calder's occasional sidelong glances, the subtle tightening of his jaw, and the way he avoided prolonged eye contact with certain guests. Even though the words were never finished, she understood the message. A secret lingered, hovering close to revelation, waiting for the right moment to surface. The missing letter had cast a shadow over the manor, and now, quietly, its influence reached the very heart of the village's social web. The manor had settled into a deceptive calm, the murmur of polite conversation and the soft clatter of crystal filling the grand hall. Miss Marple, seated near a corner, observed the subtle shifts in the room, the way hands trembled slightly as they adjusted gloves, the faint quiver in voices that tried to remain steady. She had learned to trust these small indicators, for in places like Lady Elspeth's manor, the ordinary often concealed the extraordinary. A sudden, sharp exclamation broke the quiet, drawing every eye toward the source. One of the guests, Mrs. Fairchild, stood frozen near a large sideboard, her hand extended toward an open drawer. It was clear that the drawer, previously locked, had been forced. The brass handle was twisted slightly, splintered wood visible along the edges. A collective murmur of shock and curiosity rippled through the room. Guests leaned in, some whispering speculations, others exchanging worried glances. Miss Marple rose slowly, moving toward the scene with a calm deliberation that had earned her the trust of generations. She examined the drawer carefully, noting the splintered edges, the faint smudges of fingerprints, and the subtle way the papers inside had been disturbed. Among the scattered documents, a small scrap of parchment caught her eye, partially hidden beneath a velvet pouch. Its corner was charred, the rest destroyed in what appeared to have been an attempt to conceal its contents in the nearby fireplace. The tension in the room escalated immediately. Guests murmured anxiously, some whispering of theft, others suggesting the document might have contained secrets of great importance. Even Lady Elspeth, usually composed, allowed a small crease of worry to form between her brows as she glanced at the damaged drawer and the remnants of the burned paper. The festive glow of the candles now seemed to cast long, foreboding shadows along the walls, emphasizing the unease that had taken root. Miss Marple, however, remained composed. She studied the scene quietly, noting which guests had been nearby when the discovery was made, whose hands were clean, and whose expressions betrayed hidden knowledge. The missing letter, the half-spoken confession, and now the destroyed document all seemed to converge into a pattern, subtle yet significant. Something had been attempted, something hidden or destroyed, and it was clear to her that the mystery was far from ordinary. As the manor fell into a tense hush, the soft crackle of the fire sounded unusually loud, the room suspended in a fragile moment between curiosity and fear. The threads of secrecy that wove through St. Everwood and Lady Elspeth's household had tightened, leaving every villager and every observer poised on the brink of revelation. Chapter 5. The Snowbound Revelation. The snow lay thick upon the lanes of St. Everwood, a soft, sparkling blanket that muted the usual sounds of village life. Miss Marple pulled her coat tightly around her, the wool warm against the nip of winter air, and adjusted her scarf as she stepped lightly along the frosted path. The world seemed quieter than usual, the muffled crunch of her boots the only disturbance to the perfect stillness. It was the kind of evening that encouraged reflection, the kind where secrets whispered themselves to those patient enough to listen. As she walked past shuttered cottages and frosted windows, Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward the small details that others might miss, footprints that converged then diverged in the snow, the faint hint of smoke from a hidden chimney, a door left slightly ajar in a hurried moment. Each observation added another thread to the web she was quietly weaving in her mind. The village's ordinary charm masked a network of interactions, relationships, and subtle tensions, and Miss Marple noted each nuance with care. Her thoughts drifted back to the gatherings of the past days, the church, the manor, the half-spoken confession, and the flurry of whispered gossip. Each incident had left its imprint on the village's collective consciousness, and she began to see connections others overlooked. A glance shared here, a hesitation there, a polite smile masking unease. These small signals revealed far more than overt words ever could. As she paused beneath a holly-laden archway, the lanterns lining the path casting golden halos in the snow, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of quiet observation. She noted the relationships among villagers, who lingered with whom, who avoided certain faces, and who seemed to carry the weight of unspoken knowledge. It was in these wintry lanes, removed from the bustle of hearth and manor, that the patterns emerged most clearly. The village, serene under its snowy blanket, held a subtle tension beneath its festive surface, and as Miss Marple continued her walk, she quietly pieced together the invisible threads, preparing herself for the revelations yet to come. Each step through St. Everwood was a step closer to understanding the secrets hidden beneath its holly boughs. The crisp winter air bit at Miss Marple's cheeks as she continued her quiet stroll, the snow crunching rhythmically beneath her boots. Her mind wandered to the missing letter, its invisible presence still tugging at the edges of every conversation and glance in St. Everwood. It was then, near the edge of the village green where lanterns cast long, wavering shadows, that something unusual caught her eye, a scrap of paper, half buried in the snow. Carefully, she bent to retrieve it, brushing away the frost to reveal delicate, hurried handwriting. The letters were unmistakably penned, though the style suggested haste rather than care. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. At first glance, the scrap seemed innocuous, perhaps the forgotten remainder of a note or shopping list. Yet the placement, so conspicuously near the lane frequently used by Mr. Harper, suggested an intentional hint, or perhaps a deliberate distraction. Her mind worked quickly, considering the implications. A letter missing from the post office, whispers throughout the village, and now this scrap, found just where Mr. Harper might pass. Such coincidences were rarely accidental. She noted the handwriting carefully, the slant of the letters, the pressure applied, and the flow of each curve. To the untrained eye, it might implicate him, but Miss Marple sensed a subtle discrepancy, something almost imperceptible that suggested this clue was meant to mislead. By the time she returned to the warmth of Lucy's cottage, the villagers had already begun to murmur about the scrap. "I saw it near his gate," someone claimed. "Surely it must be evidence." Another nodded solemnly, eyes wide with a thrill of discovery. The air buzzed with suspicion, quiet yet insistent, and it was clear that Mr. Harper, despite his protestations, had become the focal point of unease. Miss Marple, however, remained calm. She studied the reactions of the villagers, noting their eagerness to assign guilt based on minimal evidence. She understood perfectly how a clever red herring could shift suspicion, and she recognized that this scrap of paper, though seemingly significant, was likely designed to do just that. The intent behind it was more revealing than the writing itself, highlighting not the innocence or guilt of the accused, but the artful misdirection of someone who wished to manipulate perception. As the evening settled and snow continued to drift softly across the village, Miss Marple quietly tucked the scrap into her pocket. She allowed the villagers' whispers and glances to unfold around her, aware that the truth, as always, would require patience, observation, and the gentle unweaving of carefully laid deception. Somewhere, hidden beneath the winter frost and the veneer of festivity, the real story of the missing letter was waiting to be uncovered. The vicar's study was warm, the soft glow of a single lamp illuminating rows of well-worn books and neatly stacked papers. Outside, snow fell steadily, muffling the sounds of the village and creating a sense of isolation that seemed to draw the weight of conversation inward. Reverend Smythe sat across from Miss Marple, hands folded on his lap, his expression unusually tense. He had invited her to speak privately, away from the gossiping ears of St. Everwood's villagers, and the air between them carried the quiet gravity of matters unspoken. "I fear, Miss Marple," he began, his voice measured but laden with concern, "that the disappearance of this letter has unsettled more than just a single household. Parishioners' reputations are delicate, easily tarnished by rumor or half-truths. I have always believed in the goodness of our village, but now there is an unease creeping through the community that I cannot ignore." Miss Marple listened intently, her sharp eyes noting the careful way the vicar chose his words. Every pause, every hesitated syllable, suggested the weight of responsibility he felt, not just for the practical matter of the missing letter, but for the invisible threads of trust that held the village together. She understood instantly. For Reverend Smythe, the stakes were personal as well as moral, and the ripple effects of a single act of secrecy could threaten the harmony he had long worked to preserve. He leaned forward slightly, fingers tightening over the arms of his chair. "I have counseled some parishioners privately, urged them to be patient and kind, yet I fear that suspicion festers like frost on the branches. Small misunderstandings, half-heard whispers, even innocent coincidences, they all risk being misinterpreted." His eyes met Miss Marple's, seeking reassurance, though she offered only a quiet, knowing smile. "You are right to be concerned, Reverend," Miss Marple said softly. "Trust is fragile, and when secrets are involved, even the smallest gesture can appear significant. But do not despair. Patterns emerge, and with patience, observation, and calm attention, the truth can be uncovered without harm to those who are innocent." He exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. "Thank you, Miss Marple. Your perspective is invaluable. I only hope that the balance of our little village can be preserved before it tips too far." Outside, snow continued to drift silently over St. Everwood, and inside the study, Miss Marple pondered the delicate interplay of human nature, trust, and suspicion. In a village as close-knit as this, even the smallest disruption could ripple through countless lives, and she understood better than anyone that the missing letter's consequences were only beginning to unfold. The old church of St. Everwood, usually serene under the glow of candlelight, resonated that evening with the tentative voices of the village choir rehearsing for the Christmas Eve service. Miss Marple had wandered in quietly, enjoying the gentle harmony of voices blending together, the occasional discord only highlighting the human warmth beneath the polished performance. Snow drifted softly against the stained-glass windows, and the familiar scent of pine and candle wax lent a comforting backdrop to the music. Yet beneath the harmonious tones, Miss Marple detected tension. A low murmur between two choristers grew increasingly heated, their voices tight with frustration and barely concealed irritation. Words that were meant to be muted slipped through, accusations, defensiveness, and subtle insinuations directed toward someone else in the room. Miss Marple's eyes followed the exchange, noting the stiff posture, the quick glances around the choir loft, and the trembling of hands that should have been steady with familiarity. Finally, the disagreement reached a small crescendo, halting rehearsal abruptly. The director attempted to restore calm, gesturing for the choir to resume, but the interruption lingered like a shadow across the room. It was in these moments, Miss Marple knew, that the truth often made its first, delicate appearance. Human emotion, unguarded and uncontrolled, could betray what words carefully concealed. Alice Harper, perched near the front, whispered to Miss Marple, "Do you think it's about the letter?" Miss Marple nodded slightly, her gaze following the subtle signs, the avoidance of certain eyes, the sharp inhale when the topic of recent village events arose, the almost imperceptible twitch in one chorister's fingers. These small indicators, invisible to most, suggested that someone's agitation was not about music at all, but rather something more personal, a connection to the missing correspondence. By the time the director regained a semblance of control, the choir resumed, though the previous warmth had been replaced with a taut vigilance. Each note, each pause, seemed laden with unspoken concern, the harmony of voices undercut by a current of anxiety. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the back, catalogued every subtle gesture, every fleeting glance. The argument, brief as it had been, had offered her a glimpse into hidden fears and possible culpability, deepening the intricate tapestry of suspicion that enveloped St. Everwood. As the choir's voices rose once more, blending into the familiar melodies of the season, Miss Marple reflected that even amid music and tradition, the undercurrents of human emotion revealed truths that polite conversation could never disclose. The mystery was tightening its hold, and she knew that the threads she had observed tonight would prove vital in unraveling the secrets yet to be fully revealed. Chapter 6. Christmas Eve Secrets. The flickering firelight in Lucy's cottage cast long, dancing shadows across the walls, illuminating the faces of villagers gathered in quiet clusters. Outside, snow continued to blanket St. Everwood in a pristine hush, muffling the sounds of footsteps and carriage wheels, creating a cocoon of stillness that seemed to encourage confidences and secrets. The aroma of mulled wine and spiced biscuits mingled with the warmth of the hearth, drawing people closer together, even as the weight of unspoken fears lingered in the air. Miss Marple, seated near the fire with her knitting resting in her lap, observed the subtle dynamics unfolding around her. Guests murmured in hushed tones, careful not to carry their words beyond a few inches, yet the tension was palpable. Mrs. Pembroke whispered anxiously to a friend about the missing letter, her voice quivering slightly with worry. "I can't imagine who would do such a thing, and at Christmas of all times," she said, glancing around as if the answer might appear in the firelight. Across the room, Mr. Thompson's brow was furrowed as he spoke in measured tones, his hand gesturing subtly toward a shadowed corner. "I'm concerned," he said quietly, "that some truths are being hidden, and the consequences may ripple farther than we imagine. There are stories, little hints, whispers of things that might have gone unnoticed." Miss Marple listened attentively, her eyes flicking from face to face, noting the slight hesitations, the tightening of lips, and the almost imperceptible tremble of hands. Every gesture was meaningful, every glance could reveal a hidden truth. She catalogued them silently, assembling mental maps of relationships, motives, and subtle tensions that others overlooked. Even the youngest among them, Alice Harper, noticed the charged atmosphere, her eyes wide and curious as she whispered to Miss Marple, "Do you think anyone here knows more than they're saying?" Miss Marple inclined her head gently, acknowledging the child's intuition while keeping her own observations to herself. Outside, the wind rustled through the snow-laden trees, and the occasional chime of a distant bell echoed across the village, underscoring the quiet unease. Inside, by the fire, conversations continued, each word layered with meaning, each whisper a thread in the fabric of mystery. Miss Marple knew that within these hushed fears, the answers were beginning to surface, and the gentle unraveling of truth was already underway, even as Christmas Eve's magic glimmered faintly around them. The village of St. Everwood lay draped in snow and silence, the streets deserted save for the occasional muffled crunch of boots over frozen lanes. Lanterns cast pools of golden light, illuminating the glistening frost and creating long, wavering shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. Miss Marple, having taken a quiet walk to gather her thoughts, paused behind a frosted hedgerow, her sharp eyes catching movement in the dim glow of a lantern farther down the lane. Two figures, cloaked against the cold, were huddled close together, speaking in hushed tones as if the night itself were listening. Miss Marple's keen mind noted every detail, the way one figure's gloved hand trembled slightly, the cautious glances exchanged as if to ensure they were not overheard. The conversation was muffled, but fragments carried clearly on the cold air, mentions of a letter, a mislaid secret, and the consequences of discovery. "If anyone finds out," one voice murmured, "everything will unravel, and it cannot fall into the wrong hands." The other replied, "I only did what I thought necessary. We must be careful. No one can know, not even the vicar or Lady Elspeth." Miss Marple catalogued each word silently, noting the hesitation between phrases, the clipped tones, and the subtle emphasis placed on certain words. Even without seeing their faces clearly, she understood the gravity of their discussion. This was no ordinary matter of gossip or idle curiosity. The missing letter, the destroyed scrap, and the half-spoken confessions she had already witnessed now coalesced into a deeper, more tangled web. The figures shifted slightly, their breath misting in the frosty air, and one produced a folded envelope, glancing around nervously. It was handled carefully, the edges bent and creased from repeated folding. A fragment of a name was mentioned, though incomplete, hinting at a connection to a villager previously unsuspected. Miss Marple's mind raced, piecing together the subtle clues, the timing of the meeting, the secrecy, the careful handling of the letter. Each detail added a new layer of understanding to the puzzle she had been quietly assembling for days. As the two figures departed in opposite directions, unaware of the watchful eyes observing from behind the hedge, Miss Marple remained still, absorbing every nuance. Snowflakes settled silently around her, and the village seemed to hold its breath, as if anticipating the revelations yet to come. In the quiet of the night, the first true threads of the mystery were drawn taut, and Miss Marple knew that the path to uncovering the full truth would require patience, insight, and careful attention to the smallest of details. Miss Marple returned to the warmth of her lodgings, the frosty air of St. Everwood still clinging to her coat, and settled by the fire with a notebook and her keen observations. Candlelight flickered softly across the pages, casting shadows that danced in time with her thoughts. The events of the past days, the missing letter, the destroyed scrap, the half-spoken confession, and the midnight meeting, swirled together in her mind like pieces of a delicate puzzle. Each fragment carried meaning, but she knew instinctively that a single element remained elusive, a missing piece that would ultimately reveal the full picture. She reviewed the motives she had discerned. Greed, subtle and concealed, lay in the polished smiles and carefully chosen words of a few villagers eager for inheritance or advantage. Pride, too, whispered through tense gestures and polite corrections, an insistence on appearances and propriety that masked the human desire to maintain status and control. Love, complicated and sometimes secret, threaded its way through furtive glances and protective gestures, binding people together even as it complicated the mystery. Each motive alone might suggest direction, but only in combination did they hint at the intricacies of intent, opportunity, and secrecy. Miss Marple paused to recall the small details that often held the key to understanding human behavior. The careful handling of the scrap of handwriting, the abrupt halt to a confession, the furtive glances during the choir rehearsal, and the hushed midnight meeting, each of these acts was a clue. And yet, despite the clarity of these signals, one essential truth remained hidden, like a note missing from a familiar melody. Her eyes drifted to the envelope she had tucked away, the edges slightly worn from repeated handling. It had been the thread around which suspicion had twisted and turned, yet its full significance had not been revealed. Someone had gone to great lengths to manipulate perception, to lead others astray with red herrings and partial truths. Miss Marple smiled faintly, understanding that this careful orchestration of events was a sign not of recklessness, but of calculated intent. The night deepened, and the village of St. Everwood lay silent under its snowy blanket. By candlelight, Miss Marple weighed each fragment she had gathered, each whispered fear and observed gesture. She knew that soon the final piece would present itself, as it always did, and when it did, the intricate tapestry of greed, pride, and love would be revealed in full. Until then, she remained patient, vigilant, and quietly confident that the truth, though scattered in fragments, would be complete by morning. The clock in St. Everwood's church tower tolled softly, its deep resonance rolling across the snow-covered village, announcing the arrival of midnight. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the quiet lane, lantern in hand, the crisp air carrying the faint scent of pine and candle wax. The villagers, now hushed in anticipation of the midnight mass, gathered near the church doors, their breath forming delicate clouds in the cold night. Yet it was not the service that held Miss Marple's attention. It was the subtle alignment of all the clues she had quietly amassed over the past days. As the 12th chime echoed, a glimmer of light caught her eye, a reflection from the corner of a frosted window in the vicarage. She moved closer and, with the careful precision that had become her hallmark, discovered a folded envelope tucked behind a small potted holly bush. The handwriting, slightly smudged from frost, matched the style of the missing letter and scrap she had already examined. Her heart quickened, not with fear, but with the familiar thrill of realization. This small, overlooked detail had eluded the watchful eyes of the villagers, hidden in plain sight. Miss Marple's mind worked rapidly, connecting this new-found clue with the previous fragments: the half-spoken confession, the furtive midnight meeting, the red herring designed to mislead suspicion, and the unspoken tensions of the manor and church. Each detail now fell into place with subtle clarity. The missing letter had not simply vanished. It had been carefully relocated, and in doing so, the orchestrator of misdirection had inadvertently revealed a critical link, a motive intertwined with pride, fear, and the delicate balance of trust in St. Everwood. The bells continued their solemn tolling, echoing through the still village, while Miss Marple, standing silently in the snow, allowed herself a small, knowing smile. The moment of dawning realization was upon her. The intricate puzzle, pieced together through observation, intuition, and patience, was nearly complete. And though the villagers remained unaware of the truth, the final revelation, like the tolling of the bell, was inevitable, signaling that the hidden threads binding the mystery were about to be fully drawn together. Chapter 7. The Letter Revealed. The parlor of Lucy's cottage was warm and inviting, the hearth ablaze with a fire whose golden glow flickered across the polished wood and patterned rugs. Snow continued to fall outside, a gentle hush settling over St. Everwood, giving the room an intimate, almost secretive atmosphere. Miss Marple had sent discreet invitations to a select group of villagers, those whose actions, words, or glances had hinted at involvement in the recent mystery. Now, as they arrived one by one, the tension in the room grew quietly, layered beneath polite greetings and forced smiles. Guests settled into their seats with varying degrees of composure. Mr. Harper fidgeted with the cuff of his sleeve, Alice Harper's eyes sparkled with curiosity, and Mrs. Pembroke's lips pressed tightly together as if holding back unspoken concern. Even Lady Elspeth, resplendent in her festive attire, allowed the faintest crease of curiosity to disturb her composed demeanor. All were aware that tonight, in the glow of the firelight, something significant would unfold. Miss Marple stood near the hearth, her hands folded calmly in front of her, her sharp eyes sweeping across the assembled group. The flickering flames reflected softly on her features, giving an air of quiet authority, tempered by the gentle warmth she always carried. She began with measured words, her tone calm but compelling. "Thank you all for coming," she said. "There have been concerns, whispers, and questions in our village these past days. I believe it is time that we carefully examine the threads that have brought us to this moment." A hush fell over the room, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire. Villagers exchanged tentative glances, aware that the delicate balance of trust in their community was about to be examined. Miss Marple's presence alone lent a sense of assurance. She had the uncanny ability to navigate human complexity with insight and gentle precision. The anticipation in the room was palpable, each villager quietly bracing for revelation, each gesture revealing as much as the words that had yet to be spoken. With the firelight dancing on her calm expression, Miss Marple began to recount the events, the observations, and the subtle hints that had shaped her understanding. The stage was set. Tonight, the mystery would unravel, and the missing letters' secrets would finally come to light. Miss Marple's calm gaze swept over the gathered villagers, her fingers lightly resting on the edge of the small writing desk beside the fire. She began with a soft, deliberate voice, one that commanded attention without harshness. "We have all heard whispers," she said, "and many theories have been put forth regarding the missing letter. Tonight, I wish to untangle these threads and distinguish fact from assumption." She started with the rumors of inheritance, the talk of hidden wealth that had sparked suspicion and envy among certain villagers. "It is natural," she noted, "for people to wonder about legacies and fortunes, especially in a close-knit village such as ours. But, as careful observation shows, the inheritance story was precisely that, a story. There is no evidence to connect it to the letter's disappearance." She allowed the words to settle, letting the relief, or disappointment, spread quietly across the faces of her listeners. Next, Miss Marple addressed the more personal speculations, the romance tale whispered in corners and hushed voices. Affection, friendship, and admiration are the bonds that give life to our village. Yet they are also fertile ground for misinterpretation. The supposed romantic motive, charming as it may appear, bears no connection to the missing letter. It was, in essence, a distraction, cleverly crafted to mislead attention. A faint murmur ran through the room as villagers nodded, some reflecting on how easily emotion can cloud judgment. Then she turned to the almost confession, the fragmentary words that had so intrigued many. "Mr. Calder's hesitation," she said gently, "was not an admission of guilt but an expression of fear, fear of being misjudged and misunderstood. It is easy to confuse silence for secrecy and a faltering voice for culpability. Yet the truth, when examined carefully, reveals his innocence in this matter." She paused, allowing the weight of clarity to settle. Finally, Miss Marple wove these threads together, showing how each red herring had been placed with care to misdirect the keenest eyes in the village. The letter, the scraps, and the half-spoken confessions had created a complex web of intrigue, yet every false lead was a piece of a larger, intentional design meant to obscure the real motive. Her words were measured, but each statement gently pierced the illusions, one by one, until only the true facts remained visible in the firelight. By the end of her explanation, the villagers were silent, some in relief, others in surprise at how intricately the misdirections had been crafted. Miss Marple's methodical dismantling of the rumors and assumptions left no room for ambiguity. The web had been unraveled, and the path to the missing letter's revelation lay clear before them. Miss Marple allowed a gentle pause, letting the room settle into a hushed anticipation. The villagers leaned forward slightly, their eyes flicking from her face to one another, sensing the final revelation was at hand. The flickering fire cast dancing shadows, lending an almost theatrical air to the moment, as though the room itself awaited the unveiling of truth. It is natural to assume that wrongdoing arises from malice, greed, or vanity, Miss Marple began softly. Yet sometimes the most seemingly puzzling actions are motivated by love, concern, or the desire to protect another. The missing letter, which has caused such speculation, falls into this category. She looked toward a young woman seated near the hearth, her hands nervously clasped. The villagers followed her gaze, curiosity and tension mixing in equal measure. Miss Marple continued, her voice calm and precise. "It was you, Alice Harper, who took the letter." A collective intake of breath swept through the room. Alice's eyes widened, a mix of fear and relief crossing her features. "But," she stammered, "I didn't mean harm. I only wanted to protect my cousin." The letter contained a note from Lady Elspeth, intended to clarify a sensitive misunderstanding. If it had fallen into the wrong hands, it could have caused scandal and hurt someone dearly. "I thought that by hiding it temporarily, I could prevent unnecessary distress until the truth could be revealed safely." The villagers murmured, astonished by the unexpected motive. Miss Marple nodded gently, encouraging calm reflection. Alice's actions, though technically a misappropriation, were guided by concern rather than ill intent. The letter's contents revealed a simple truth, one that clears up the confusion, corrects the assumptions, and restores the reputations of those involved. It was never meant to be a tool of harm, merely a private correspondence that became the focus of suspicion due to circumstance and misunderstanding. Lady Elspeth, who had listened with keen interest, rose and approached Alice, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You acted with care and loyalty, dear child," she said warmly. "The village may have misunderstood, but the truth now shines clearly." Miss Marple, settling back in her chair, allowed a faint smile. "And so," she concluded, "the threads have been untangled. No malice guided these events, only the well-intentioned desire to shield others from embarrassment or pain. The mystery of the missing letter is solved, and St. Everwood may once more enjoy its peaceful, festive season." A gentle applause rippled through the room, the villagers' relief palpable. The fire crackled merrily as the tension melted away, and in the warm glow of understanding, the lessons of trust, observation, and human kindness lingered long after the letter had been returned to its rightful place. Morning broke over St. Everwood with a soft, golden light that glinted off snow-laden rooftops and frosted hedges. The village, once restless with whispers and speculation, now exhaled a collective sigh of relief. Windows sparkled with sunlight, church bells rang joyfully, and the promise of a peaceful Christmas morning seemed to settle over every street and lane. The tension that had threaded through the community had dissolved, replaced by a gentle, easy camaraderie. Miss Marple strolled slowly through the village, her coat snug against the crisp winter air, and observed the subtle return of harmony. Neighbors exchanged warm greetings, children laughed as they skated on frozen ponds, and even those previously ensnared by suspicion moved with lighter hearts. The missing letter, now safely returned, had restored more than a mere piece of correspondence. It had mended trust, alleviated fear, and reminded the villagers of the value of patience and careful thought. She paused near the old stone bridge, watching snowflakes drift lazily onto the flowing river below. Quietly, she reflected on human nature, its fragility, its propensity for misunderstanding, and its capacity for compassion. In her experience, even the smallest acts of kindness or caution could ripple outward, preventing harm and fostering reconciliation. Forgiveness, she mused, was often easier to extend once the truth was seen, gently illuminated like the morning sun over frost-covered rooftops. By midday, families gathered around festively adorned tables, and the warm smell of roast and spices filled cottages. Miss Marple, smiling softly, joined her goddaughter's household, content to observe the simple pleasures of the season: laughter, shared stories, and the quiet satisfaction of justice tempered with understanding. The mystery had resolved, but more importantly, the village's spirit had been preserved. As she sipped her tea by the hearth, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, knowing smile. The events of the past days, though unsettling, had revealed the resilience and tenderness of her fellow villagers. In St. Everwood, life would continue, quietly enriched by the lessons of patience, vigilance, and the quiet strength of truth, an enduring reminder that even amid intrigue and uncertainty, the heart of a community could remain steadfast, warm, and united. Outside, snow continued to fall in gentle, sparkling flakes, blanketing the village of St. Everwood in a quiet serenity. Carols drifted softly from the church tower, mingling with the laughter of children building snowmen and sliding along frozen ponds. Smoke curled from chimneys, carrying the comforting scent of roasting chestnuts and spiced cider, while the warm glow of lamplight reflected off frosted windows. The village, once filled with whispers and tension, now thrummed with a simple, untroubled joy. Inside Lucy's cottage, Miss Marple sat comfortably by the hearth, her knitting resting lightly in her lap. Her sharp eyes, so often discerning and alert, softened in the firelight, watching the flickering flames as though contemplating the small, intricate puzzle of human behavior she had untangled over the past days. Though the mystery had been solved, she remained quietly observant, savoring the ordinary moments that revealed the enduring kindness, resilience, and subtle foibles of her fellow villagers. The peace of the season settled gently around her, and in that warmth, a reflective calm embraced all of St. Everwood. It was a reminder that even amid secrets and mischief, understanding and patience could restore harmony, and that vigilance paired with compassion was the quiet backbone of a community. And now, dear friends, as the snow continues to fall softly over rooftops and lanterns glow in the twilight, we leave you with a gentle question. Do you think you would have spotted the culprit before Miss Marple did? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us hear your theories. If you enjoyed unraveling the mystery alongside our clever detective, please like, subscribe, and join us for the next cozy tale. Until then, may your holidays be filled with warmth, wonder, and the quiet satisfaction of a mystery well solved.